Hey guys, tonight we slip into the muddy boots of a medieval villager, trudging through frost-nipped fields as the sun drops early behind skeletal trees. You probably won't survive this winter without proper preparation. But don't worry, you'll get a front-row seat to the messy, aromatic, slightly smelly reality of pre-modern life. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments, so I know which time zone you're escaping from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're hauling your first bundle of firewood, and the dampness of the forest floor clings to your boots. Pine needles stick to your legs, and the scent of wet earth and resin fills your nose. A sharp contrast to the smoky warmth you're aiming to create back home. Every log is heavy, and you grunt as you drag it toward the village. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers preferred oak for its long burn or ash for ease of splitting. And you silently vote for whichever burns without the smoke in your eyes. Occasionally, a branch snaps underfoot with a satisfying crunch, startling the birds into brief flight, which makes you chuckle if only you had the energy to track them down for dinner. Somewhere between hauling and stacking, you notice that everyone has their own secret for transporting wood. One neighbor ties small bundles together with twine, another balances a single massive log across broad shoulders. You try the latter and almost topple into a muddy puddle, earning a soft laugh from an older villager who shakes his head. Fringe lore claims that stepping on the wrong side of a fallen branch can summon a winter spirit that follows you home. And you can't help imagining a tiny imp hiding in your boots, ready to gnaw your toes if you complain. The sun drops faster than you expect, and you start to stack logs in neat rows near the hearth, feeling the first real chill creep through your tunic. Smoke from the neighbor's chimney curls into the twilight sky, and you can almost taste the warmth that will come once these piles ignite. Your hands ache, raw from hauling and gripping bark. But there's a rhythm to it that lulls you slightly, almost like a primitive ASMR, minus the luxury headphones. You pause to wipe your brow and notice the difference between freshly chopped wood and older, seasoned logs. The newer stuff spits sparks when struck against stone, a small reminder that fire is a living, unpredictable companion. You glance at the surrounding forest again, noting the birds hunkered in the bare branches and the occasional squirrel that hasn't yet hidden its winter stash. You remember a quirky fact you heard from an elderly storyteller. Some villagers would smear their hands with ash to keep insects away while working outdoors. You try a bit and are mildly horrified when the gritty powder cakes into your nails, but it seems effective. Historians still argue whether such practices were commonplace or merely the eccentricity of a few inventive individuals. As twilight deepens, you trudge back with another load of wood, now lighter on confidence but heavier on exhaustion. Each log feels like a small victory, a tangible contribution to surviving the cold nights ahead. You start to notice the subtle differences in bark texture, how some logs almost hum when tapped, and the faint scent of sap that promises a long, slow burn. A crow caws somewhere in the distance, and you imagine it as a medieval alarm clock heralding the onset of night. When you finally stack enough to fill the hearth's storage nook, you step back and admire the chaotic geometry of your labor. The logs are arranged haphazardly, yet with surprising efficiency, a testimony to instinct rather than formal planning. Your back protests, and you stretch while trying to ignore the occasional squeak of your boots in the mud. Fringe tales suggest that logs stacked incorrectly might anger household spirits. And you make a mental note to whisper an apology just in case. You trudge home, shoulders aching, lungs full of cold forest air, and begin to consider the next step, preparing kindling for those first sparks that will banish darkness. You find smaller twigs and brittle branches, snapping them into manageable lengths. The smell of fresh-cut wood mixes with your own sweat, creating a pungent but oddly satisfying perfume. You notice that some villagers prefer bark stripped from branches as tinder, believing it catches fire faster, while others swear by dried moss tucked beneath logs. Historians still argue whether one method was genuinely superior or simply a matter of personal superstition. By the time the final pile is ready, the village is cloaked in deepening twilight. You light a small test fire, the flame flickering and casting long shadows across the packed dirt floor. Sparks rise lazily toward the low ceiling, and you marvel at the delicate balance between too little fuel and too much. Fringe wisdom suggests tossing a pinch of salt onto the embers to keep them alive longer, and you comply, watching the subtle hiss and tiny burst of heat that seems almost magical. As you sit beside the warm glow, listening to the crackle and pop of burning wood, your thoughts wander to the villagers' broader struggle. Winter isn't just cold, it's a test of foresight, patience, and ingenuity. Each log represents hours of labor, the sweat of 100 hands that came before you, the silent knowledge passed down through generations. Historians still debate whether villagers ever truly enjoyed this work or simply endured it because survival demanded it. You chuckle quietly at the thought, imagining posting a TikTok of yourself grimacing while hauling firewood through mud, and realize that some things really haven't changed. Finally, you allow yourself a brief rest, leaning back against the stacked logs, feeling the gentle warmth radiate through your tired muscles. You can hear the wind rustle through the trees outside, carrying the first whispers of frost. Your eyes start to droop slightly, soothed by the combination of physical exhaustion, the hypnotic flicker of firelight, and the intimate connection to centuries of villagers who did the same, night after night, year after year. Remember that crooked branch you almost tripped over? It's still there, silently witnessing your perseverance. As the fire settles into a steady glow, you know this is just the beginning of the preparations. You've conquered the forest, tamed the logs, and coaxed a flame into life. But tomorrow, there will be more tasks, more layering, more planning. For now, though, the rhythmic crackle is enough. Fringe tales or historical fact, you're starting to understand the essence of winter readiness. Patience, repetition, and respect for both the predictable and the capricious. You wake to the faint gray light filtering through the narrow window, a reminder that winter is coming and the harvest must be preserved. Outside, frost crystals cling to the grass, glinting like tiny jewels in the early dawn. You probably won't survive the season without careful attention to what the land has yielded. And today your focus is on transforming summer's bounty into winter's security. So you roll up your sleeves and with a sigh, step into the cool kitchen, where the scent of lingering smoke from last night's fire still hangs in the air. The first task is fruit. Apples, pears, and quinces are laid out in a patchwork on the table. You peel and core, tossing misshapen ones into a separate pile for cooking or fermentation. You notice that some villagers slice fruit thinly and dry it in the sun, while others employ a low, steady fire indoors, coaxing moisture from the flesh. A quirky trick you overheard last week is rubbing the slices with a bit of soot to deter insects, a practice that seems messy at first, but is said to be surprisingly effective. Historians still argue whether these preservation methods were chosen more for practicality or because tradition dictated them. Next, you turn to meat. Salt pork is your main focus, and you realize just how labor-intensive this process can be. You rub coarse salt into the cuts, making sure every crevice is coated. Fringe lore claims that adding a dash of ash helps the meat last longer, suggestion you follow, even if you suspect it's more superstition than science. Meanwhile, you notice a neighbor carefully layering pork and salt in a clay pot. Thinking about how such storage methods might have evolved regionally, based on climate, soil, or even superstition. Herbs are next on your checklist. Sage, thyme, and rosemary hang in bundles from the rafters, drying slowly above the hearth. You gently shake the bundles, releasing earthy aromas that mingle with the smell of wood smoke. Some villagers tie sprigs in fragrant bunches to keep away pests, while others swear by tossing leaves into cooking pots to enhance flavor. Historians still argue whether these herbs were valued primarily for taste, medicine, or ritual. You pause and inhale, noticing how these smells instantly shift your mood, tiny, aromatic comfort against the chill creeping in from the door. You move to vegetables, washing root crops in cold water before storing them in barrels of sand to prevent frost damage. Carrots, turnips, and parsnips, still gritty from the earth, are carefully nestled. A practice that seems tedious until you remember the weeks of potential food scarcity ahead. Fringe accounts mention burying a few potatoes under straw specifically to fool malevolent spirits. And you can't help smirking at the thought of ghostly culinary sabotage. While working, your mind wanders to preservation debates. Should you focus on quantity or quality? Salt versus smoke? Clay pot versus woven basket? Historians still argue whether villagers employed strict methods or if improvisation was the real norm, and you begin to appreciate the ingenuity born from necessity. You spread a thin layer of grains on a table to air dry, noting the subtle hum of activity in the household. Children scurry about, some helping, some more interested in stealing an apple slice or two, reminding you that survival often involved negotiation with small, persistent negotiators. You pause at the barrels of pickled vegetables, checking brine levels. Cucumbers, cabbage, and leeks bob beneath the surface, releasing sharp, tangy scents. Fringe wisdom holds that a pinch of sugar in the brine keeps spirits cheerful, or at least that's the story you heard from the village storyteller. As you stir gently, you notice how communal these tasks have become. Neighbors often trade excesses: a barrel of pickles for a sack of flour, a few dried apples for a jar of honey. Historians still debate whether such exchanges were formal market transactions or more casual necessity-driven bartering. But either way, you see the efficiency in sharing labor and resources. You step outside briefly, inhaling crisp air, then return to the hearth. You boil water to sterilize jars for preserves, careful not to scald your fingers. The steam rises, carrying hints of herbs and fruit, and you catch yourself daydreaming about modern conveniences. Like electric dehydrators, luxuries medieval villagers could only imagine. You chuckle, remembering the soot trick for insect deterrence and the peculiar superstition of tossing a pinch of salt onto meat for longevity. Blending the practical and the mystical in ways that make modern minds raise eyebrows. As midday approaches, you focus on fermentation. Apples for cider, plums for brandy. Even vegetables and brine all require a delicate touch. You monitor temperatures by feel rather than thermometer, relying on the soft signs of bubbling and aroma to judge readiness. Fringe practices insist on whispering intentions to the fermenting jars, a gesture thought to influence taste or luck. Historians still argue whether these whispers affected outcomes or were merely ritualistic. You indulge in a quiet smile, imagining tiny jar spirits nodding along as you go about your work. By late afternoon, your kitchen table is a mosaic of preserved bounty: glistening salted meat, dried fruits, fragrant herbs, pickled vegetables, and grains ready for winter meals. Each jar, bundle, and barrel represents hours of effort, a testament to human foresight and a hint of superstition, blending survival instinct with cultural rhythm. You lean back, tired but satisfied, knowing that when snow finally falls, these preparations will be your armor against the relentless cold. The smell of smoke from neighboring hearths drifts through the window, mingling with the sweet and savory scents in your kitchen. You take a deep breath, imagining the coming nights when families huddle together, slicing dried fruit and savoring preserved meat, sharing stories warmed by the glow of firelight. Fringe accounts suggest that some families kept a lucky jar of pickles untouched until midwinter, claiming it brought fortune or health. You ponder whether it's faith, luck, or psychological comfort. Appreciate that perhaps it doesn't matter. The ritual itself provides structure, reassurance, and a tangible sense of control in a world otherwise dictated by weather and seasons. As dusk falls, you take a final inventory. Nothing is wasted. Broken or imperfect fruit becomes compote. Cracked eggs are preserved in salt. Even small scraps of meat and grain are repurposed into stock or feed. Historians still argue whether this meticulous attention to detail was universal or a reflection of only the most diligent households, but in your hands. Each action feels purposeful. Fringe tidbits of knowledge, smearing soot, whispering to jars. Layering salt in to weave seamlessly with practical techniques. Reminding you that medieval ingenuity balanced logic with ritual, survival with a touch of magic. The fire crackles softly in the corner, casting long, flickering shadows across the packed earth floor. You wipe your hands on a rag, feeling the warm, fragrant air brush against your cheeks. The work of preservation is complete, at least for now, leaving you a moment to sit and absorb the textures, smells, and quiet satisfaction of a day well spent. You notice the rhythm of the household, the distant murmur of neighbors, the occasional clatter of a wooden spoon, the faint cry of a child hungry for the fruit you dried earlier. Everything seems woven together, a delicate tapestry of human effort, tradition, and a few eccentric rituals that make life both challenging and charming. Finally, you step back and admire your winter bounty. Barrels and jars, bundles and strings, all aligned and ready. You can almost hear the whispers of the fruit and vegetables, the hum of grains in storage, all promising sustenance and survival. You know that when the snow and frost arrive, the comfort of this labor will reveal itself, warming not just the body, but the spirit. And as you glance around at the fruits of your careful, sometimes quirky, sometimes mystical labor, you realize that preparation isn't just about food. It's about agency, rhythm, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you did everything possible to face the cold with resilience. You drag yourself from the comforting warmth of the preserved kitchen into the chill of the morning, realizing that surviving winter isn't just about food, it's about clothing too. The wind nips at your ears and fingers, reminding you that thin tunics and worn boots won't be enough when snow piles higher than your knees. You probably won't survive the season without thick layers, sturdy fabrics, and a little ingenuity, so you gather wool, leather, and scraps of cloth. Mentally preparing for the long hours of stitching ahead. The first task is mending worn clothing. Your own tunic has patches along the elbows and underarms. Evidence of countless chores, scrapes, and fireside squabbles with siblings. You thread a needle and pull it through the thick wool, the coarse fibers biting slightly at your fingers. You notice your neighbor's haphazard stitches and recall the quirky practice of sewing. A small charm into the hem to ward off illness, a bit of superstition tucked into practical necessity. Historians still argue whether layering really kept the cold out, or if warmth depended more on the body's own metabolism and constant movement. Next, you tackle boots. Leather stiffened by cold weather cracks easily, so you apply a mixture of fat and beeswax, rubbing it into every crevice to restore suppleness. Fringe tales suggest talking to your boots while doing this, praising their strength and pleading for a winter without blisters. You shake your head, but do it anyway, muttering something along the lines of, "Carry me without complaint." It feels absurd, but somehow comforting, as if your effort is acknowledged by these inanimate companions. Fur accents are next. You attach small scraps of rabbit fur to hoods, sleeves, and collars, both for warmth and, frankly, style. Oddly enough, in some villages, fancier fur indicated status. A wealthier neighbor might sport a hood lined with squirrel or fox. Historians still debate whether this was purely decorative or a subtle form of signaling resilience to harsh winters. You find the addition ridiculous, yet practical suddenly. The wind feels slightly less bitter against your neck. You then turn to gloves and mittens. Wool is your friend here, spun thick and rough. You carefully knit a pair while sitting near the fire, your fingers cramped but moving with the rhythm of countless winters gone by. Fringe wisdom holds that slipping a tiny pinch of herbs into each glove protects against frostbite, a tradition you follow. Chuckling at the notion of peppermint-scented hands warding off hypothermia. Layering is the next challenge. You dress in multiple tunics, each heavier than the last, interspersed with linen undergarments and woolen outerwear. You adjust leather belts and straps to secure the layers without cutting off circulation. Historians still argue whether the average villager could realistically move and work comfortably with 4 or 5 layers, or whether flexibility was sacrificed entirely for warmth. You test each motion, crouching and lifting, realizing that some layering is as much art as science. Hats and hoods demand attention. A woolen hood pulled snug over the ears and tied under the chin is non-negotiable. You notice fringe beliefs about stitching small symbols into the lining to keep headaches at bay during long, dark months. Whether these practices offered any real health benefits is disputed among scholars, but the psychological comfort they provided was likely invaluable. You tug your hood down over your hair, feeling an odd blend of protection and pride in your handiwork. Socks and leg coverings are next. Thick wool socks are tucked into boots with extra layers around calves to stave off frostbite. Oddly, some villagers would stuff straw between layers for insulation, a tactic that sounds bizarre until you realize how much heat a simple air pocket can retain. Historians still debate whether straw lining was common or an idiosyncratic solution limited to the coldest regions. You shuffle around the room, testing your grip and stride. The combination of wool, leather, and straw surprisingly effective. You pause to inspect cloaks. These heavy woolen capes drape over your shoulders, offering protection from wind and snow. Fringe stories suggest that tying a small bell to the hem wards off malevolent spirits, an eccentric habit you indulge in while shrugging into the cloak. Historians still argue whether such superstitions were genuinely believed or performed for community amusement. But you admit it does make you feel slightly more invincible as you move through the dimly lit room. Next, you address repairs for children's clothing. Small tunics and tiny boots require careful attention. Frayed hems are mended, and mittens are stitched in pairs. You notice the quirky tradition of sewing a small animal shape onto a child's garment, thought to protect them from winter illness. You wonder if this is merely symbolic, or if the tactile comfort of the sewn creature offers real reassurance. Either way, it keeps the children engaged, peering over your shoulder with curious eyes, sometimes helping, sometimes pulling at the threads. Finally, you examine belts, pouches, and accessories. Each layer of clothing has a purpose, but function and storage are critical. Leather belts hold small pouches of herbs, flint, or spare needles, while fabric straps ensure cloaks stay in place during work. Fringe tales suggest whispering the intended use of each pouch to ensure its effectiveness, a practice you replicate with a quiet smile. Historians still debate whether the organization of these small items was structured or left to the whims of daily necessity. But your setup feels just right: efficient, practical, and slightly superstitious. By evening, you are layered, mended, and surprisingly stylish. The chill no longer bites as sharply, the wool absorbs the brunt of the wind, and the boots feel snug and reliable. You step outside briefly to test mobility, crouching, lifting, and walking through frost-kissed grass. Everything works in harmony. Every stitch, layer, and charm contributes to survival. Fringe practices, superstitions, and odd habit stalking to boots. Sewing tiny charms, adding straw and weave with practical techniques seamlessly. Historians still debate which methods were truly effective and which were psychological or ritualistic. But from your perspective, the result is clear: warmth, resilience, and peace of mind. As night falls, you sit by the fire, sipping weak ale and admiring your handiwork. The smell of wool, leather, and smoke fills the room, comforting and familiar. You think about the coming days, knowing each step in clothing preparation is not just survival, but a ritual. A rhythm passed through generations, blending practicality, superstition, and the occasional touch of whimsy. In this layered cocoon, you feel ready for the darkness and cold, ready to face winter with both ingenuity and a wink at the quirks that make life memorable. You wake to the smell of burning wood and the lingering scent of herbs, knowing that today's task is just as critical as yesterday's: stocking the larder. You probably won't survive the winter without a well-organized supply of food. So you brace yourself for lifting barrels, stacking sacks, and arranging jars in precise, slightly obsessive order. Outside, frost sparkles on the rooftops, hinting that soon you'll be entirely dependent on what you've carefully stored. Your first stop is the grains. Barley, oats, rye, and wheat are delivered in large sacks, some slightly damp from the morning dew. You spread them across tables and check for any sign of pests or mold, shaking your head at a few rogue kernels that seem determined to spoil the batch. Fringe lore suggests that adding a bay leaf to each barrel keeps weevils at bay, a ritual you indulge in, lining the grains with tiny aromatic shields. Historians still argue whether these methods genuinely worked or were mainly a form of psychological reassurance, but the practice feels reassuring nonetheless. Next, you tackle salted and smoked fish. Herring and mackerel arrive in brine, packed tightly into wooden barrels. You rinse a few pieces, inhale the pungent aroma, and arrange them carefully in layers with coarse salt. Fringe traditions hold that a small coin tucked into the barrel brings prosperity in the new year, a practice you follow with a bemused smile. Historians still debate whether villagers actually adhered to these rituals, or if they were regional eccentricities. But either way, they offer comfort against the uncertainty of winter. Barrels of salted pork are stacked nearby, their robust smell mingling with the fish and grains. You tap each barrel, listening for hollow or damp spots, moving anything suspect to the side for extra attention. Fringe tales insist that wrapping a small sprig of rosemary around the pork enhances flavor and luck. You oblige, feeling oddly ceremonial as you slide the bundles into their designated spots. Historians still argue whether salt and spice combinations were chosen for taste, preservation, or both. Vegetables stored for the long months ahead are next. Root crops, cabbages, and onions are nestled in barrels of sand, soil, or sawdust, depending on local custom. You press gently on each layer, ensuring nothing is bruised and that air circulates enough to prevent rot. Some villagers tie herbs to the tops of barrels as a charm against spoilage, another fringe tradition you silently replicate, smiling at the odd mix of practicality and superstition that governs these actions. Historians still debate whether layering systems were systematic or improvised, but your method feels like a blend of both. You move to jars of preserves, jams, and pickled vegetables. Each jar is inspected, the lids checked, the contents observed for bubbles or discoloration. Fringe lore suggests tapping the jars 3 times before sealing, a ritual meant to ward off bad luck or unseen pests. You tap gently, half laughing at the absurdity, yet secretly pleased to feel control over something as unpredictable as fermentation. Historians still argue whether these rituals influenced actual preservation, but the sense of agency alone is enough to calm the mind. Barrels of honey are lined along the far wall, their golden sheen catching the low afternoon light. You top each barrel with a thin layer of wax to prevent fermentation and cover the surface with cloth. Fringe accounts suggest whispering a wish into the honey before sealing it fortune. Health, or a mild winter end. You hum quietly, indulging the superstition because it feels comforting. Historians still debate whether honey was considered a mundane ingredient, a medicinal staple, or a magical food, and you find yourself somewhere between all three. Sacks of beans and legumes are next. You sift through them carefully, removing any shriveled or discolored seeds. Some villagers add a sprig of sage to each sack to protect against spoilage and insect infestation. You do the same, appreciating the mingling of scent, ritual, and practicality. Historians still argue whether these superstitions were symbolic, habitual, or genuinely effective. But for now, the aroma of sage and dried legumes is enough to lift your spirits. You step back and examine the larder in its entirety. Barrels, sacks, and jars form an organized patchwork. each item carefully positioned to maximize accessibility and preservation. Fringe lore suggests storing heavier items at the bottom and lighter ones at the top for luck as much as practicality. And you nod, satisfied that your arrangement adheres to both efficiency and tradition. Historians still debate whether medieval villagers truly rotated supplies or simply used whatever was on top, but your meticulous arrangement feels purposeful. Next, you consider the storage environment itself. Ventilation, dryness, and darkness are essential for long-term preservation. You prop open small windows to allow gentle airflow and check for drafts that could freeze or dampen your larder. Fringe traditions suggest hanging a small mirror or crystal near the entrance to reflect malevolent spirits. A practice you quietly indulge in, smiling at the subtle mix of superstition and necessity. Historians still argue whether architectural features were designed for practical storage or ritual protection, and you begin to appreciate how intertwined these motivations often were. You turn your attention to rotation and labeling. Each barrel, jar, and sack is marked with its contents and the date of storage. Some villagers employed tally sticks or chalk marks on lids, while others relied on memory and intuition. Fringe tales suggest marking a small symbol of a sun or moon to invoke longevity for the stored goods. And you follow the practice, imagining tiny celestial guardians watching over your provisions. Historians still debate the prevalence of formal record-keeping in medieval households, but your method feels thorough, reassuring, and just a little playful. As evening falls, you haul one last barrel into place, muscles aching but spirits lifted. The larder, now brimming with grains, salted fish, meat, preserved vegetables. Honey and beans is a fortress against hunger and uncertainty. Fringe practices, charms, and rituals have been woven seamlessly into the process, adding a layer of comfort and tradition alongside practical skill. Historians still argue how much of this care was necessity versus ritual, but you find the distinction almost irrelevant. The act itself is what matters. You step back, breathing deeply, taking in the aroma of salt, smoke, honey, and herbs. Each barrel, each jar, each sack is a promise of warmth and sustenance during the harsh months to come. The effort is exhausting, repetitive, yet profoundly satisfying. You notice the glow from the hearth reflecting off the barrels, casting long, flickering shadows across the floor. This larder is more than storage. It is a statement of resilience, foresight, and a touch of creativity that has carried villagers through generations. Finally, you allow yourself a quiet moment, brushing crumbs from your sleeves and rubbing sore shoulders. The larder is complete, meticulously organized, and infused with centuries of wisdom, superstition, and ingenuity. The thought of the coming winter feels slightly less daunting, the fear of scarcity softened by tangible preparation. Fringe rituals, practical knowledge, and communal lore have combined to create a sanctuary of food that will sustain you, your family, and perhaps even a few wandering neighbors in need. You exhale, letting the quiet of the room, the aroma of preserved bounty, and the satisfaction of a job well done settle over you. A gentle prelude to the cold nights ahead. You step outside into a crisp morning, noticing frost-laced rooftops and the first glint of sunlight on icicles hanging from the eaves. Winter is looming, and now it's time to fortify your home. You probably won't survive the season if your walls, roof, and doors aren't up to the challenge, so today is dedicated to patching, bracing, and shoring up your shelter against the cold, the wind, and the occasional surprise snowstorm. The first task is the roof. Thatched roofs, thick with straw, are surprisingly vulnerable to wind and moisture. You climb a ladder carefully, your boots crunching on frost-hardened earth. Some villagers add layers of mud atop the straw, while others secure it with ropes to prevent shifting in strong gusts. Fringe practices suggest tying a small piece of ribbon or a charm to the ridge, supposedly keeping spirits of misfortune from loosening the thatch. Historians still debate whether these rituals offered any practical benefit or were purely symbolic, but as you tie your tiny charm, you can't help but feel a little safer, like a medieval insurance policy. Next, you inspect the walls. Cracks and gaps are inevitable in wattle and daub construction. You mix mud, straw, and clay, pressing it firmly into holes and smoothing surfaces. Fringe tales claim that whispering protective words while patching keeps the home secure, a practice you replicate with a quiet, half-amused mutter. Historians still argue whether these homes were reinforced more for structural integrity or as part of ritualized protection. And as you smear the thick mixture into the wall, you appreciate how the two could coexist seamlessly. Chinking between timbers comes next. You work meticulously, filling gaps with moss or clay to prevent drafts. The wind whistles outside, a stark reminder of how necessary these small adjustments are. Fringe advice sometimes suggests sprinkling a pinch of salt in the gaps to confuse winter spirits. And you do it for fun, imagining tiny invisible sentinels patrolling your walls. Historians still debate whether these minor measures were ever genuinely effective or simply a comforting gesture. Doors and window shutters require attention. Wooden doors can warp or loosen with frost, and gaps under sills can let in cold air. You hammer, wedge, and brace where needed, testing each door until it closes with a satisfying thud. Fringe traditions include hanging garlic or herbs over entrances for luck. And you can't resist placing a small bundle above the latch, partly in jest, partly in hope. Historians still argue whether these rituals were widespread or localized oddities. But you note that any extra layer of protection, practical or symbolic's welcome. Chimneys and hearths need inspection. Soot buildup can cause fires, so you scrape and clean diligently, careful not to breathe in too much smoke. Fringe lore suggests tossing a pinch of flour into the flue to keep sparks under control. A trick you replicate with skepticism, observing the subtle puff of dust as it rises. Historians still argue whether medieval chimney maintenance was consistently effective or more haphazard. But the attention itself increases your confidence in the home's warmth. You turn to exterior reinforcements. Wooden beams supporting the walls are checked for rot, and you brace any wobbling sections with extra timber. Fringe traditions advise placing small charms or symbols along the beams, supposedly lending strength beyond the material. You follow along with a quiet smile, tying a carved wooden figure to the central support. Historians still debate whether such practices were widely believed or mostly anecdotal. But you admit it makes the house feel sturdier, if only psychologically. Inside, you reinforce furniture and storage areas. Shelves holding jars of preserves and barrels of grains are double-checked for stability, lest a collapse ruin months of preparation. Fringe superstition suggests that knocking gently on each shelf while stacking items keeps the spirits. Content and prevents accidents. You oblige, tapping the wood as you arrange items, thinking of it as both ritual and quality control. Historians still argue whether these customs were practical, symbolic, or both. You inspect the flooring. Dirt floors are packed firmly to prevent drafts and dampness. Straw mats are refreshed, and rugs move strategically to block chill from low doorways. Fringe practices include scattering small tokens under mats to protect the family, a habit you replicate for fun, imagining tiny guardians peeking out from beneath the straw. Historians still debate whether such rituals were genuinely believed, but the tactile comfort they provide is undeniable. As afternoon progresses, you turn to fortifying storage spaces. Larders, cellars, and pantries are inspected. Loose planks are secured, gaps filled, and containers repositioned. Fringe advice sometimes recommends leaving a single jar of food untouched as an offering to unseen spirits, ensuring abundance for the household. You indulge, quietly placing a small pot of honey in the back corner. Historians still argue whether this was a common practice or a regional quirk. But the symbolism gives you a surprising sense of reassurance. You pause to review the entire house. Thatched roof, patched walls, braced doors, reinforced furniture, and secure storage all come together into a coherent structure capable of withstanding winter's harshness. Fringe rituals have added a layer of symbolic protection, weaving superstition with practical preparation. Historians still debate how much of medieval home fortification was ritualized versus strictly functional, but standing back and surveying your work, it feels complete. The house exudes warmth, safety, and a quiet resilience. As evening approaches, you light the hearth and watch shadows play across the reinforced walls. The scent of smoke mingles with the earthy aroma of mud and straw, a comforting reminder of your labor. You notice small details, the faint hum of the wind against the walls, the creak of timbers, the reassuring weight of closed doors. Each measure taken today, practical or symbolic, contributes to a feeling of security that is as psychological as it is structural. Fringe practices, charm placements, and whispered protections mingle with solid craftsmanship to create a sanctuary against winter's onslaught. Finally, you sink into a chair near the hearth, rubbing sore hands and admiring the fruits of the day. The home is ready, structurally sound, insulated, and symbolically protected. Every charm, brace, patch, and ritual serves both practicality and tradition, weaving a cocoon of warmth, safety, and subtle magic. You exhale, letting the satisfaction of preparation wash over you, knowing that when the storms come, your house will not only endure, but provide comfort, heat, and a gentle rhythm of life for you and your family. You rise with the pale light of dawn filtering through the frost-laced window, realizing that the next crucial step in winter preparation lies in tending to the animals. You probably won't survive the season, or at least your household won't if the pigs, cows, sheep, and chickens aren't cared for, fed, and safely sheltered. Outside, the air is crisp and carries a faint aroma of straw, hay, and lingering smoke. You step into the barn, boots sinking slightly into the cold, packed dirt floor, and prepare for the rhythm of chores that will fill the day. First, you inspect the livestock. Pigs grunt from their pens, shuffling in straw to keep warm. You scoop hay, sprinkle feed, and check each animal for signs of illness or frostbite. Fringe traditions suggest whispering gentle words to the pigs as you feed them, promising them comfort through the winter, and you mutter a quiet, "You'll survive this," half seriously, half amused. Historians still question whether such rituals had practical benefits or were purely psychological. But the act itself seems to foster attentiveness, which is practically invaluable. You move on to the cows, who huddle together for warmth in the barn. You brush their coats, check for sores, and adjust the straw bedding to ensure insulation. Fringe wisdom holds that speaking directly into a cow's ear while brushing will improve milk yield, a practice you replicate with a wry grin. Historians still argue whether these interactions affected production or were symbolic gestures, but you notice that the process keeps you focused, patient, and alert, traits any medieval villager needed. Sheep require particular attention. Their wool is both a resource and a comfort during the long months. You guide them toward shelter, making sure lambs are safely nestled under use, and inspect wool for cleanliness. Fringe lore sometimes prescribes marking the flock with simple symbols to protect them from disease or predators. You mimic the marks with chalk, thinking less about superstition and more about tracking individual sheep. But it's amusing to imagine tiny, invisible guardians keeping watch over your flock. Historians still debate whether these symbolic practices were regional quirks or widespread cultural norms. Chickens are a constant challenge. They dart about the yard, scratching for seeds hidden beneath frozen earth. You coax them into coops, close doors securely, and scatter extra straw for warmth. Fringe beliefs hold that whistling while feeding chickens will ensure a steady supply of eggs throughout winter. You try it, softly whistling a familiar tune as you distribute feed, noticing the birds' curious, cautious glances. Historians still argue whether such habits had measurable outcomes or were mere traditions, but it adds rhythm and cheer to your morning. Water supply is next. Frozen troughs are a real hazard, so you chip ice carefully and refill containers, ensuring all animals have access to fresh liquid. Fringe tales suggest tossing a pinch of salt into water to keep spirits or frost at bay. and you indulge, enjoying the blend of practicality and ritual. Historians still debate the prevalence and efficacy of such methods, but for now, the animals drink, safe and warm, and you feel a small victory. You check the barn's structural integrity. Wind and snow could collapse weak sections, so you reinforce beams and fill gaps with straw and mud. Fringe superstitions advise hanging protective charms on support posts, which you dutifully place. Historians still argue whether these measures were functional, symbolic, or both, and you realize that in this case, practicality and ritual merge seamlessly. A well-braced barn keeps animals warm, and the charms provide a comforting psychological layer. Midday brings feeding and sorting tasks. You distribute grain, chopped root vegetables, and hay, ensuring each pen receives enough for several days. Fringe tales sometimes instruct, sprinkling a pinch of sugar on the feed to promote health and happiness. You follow along with a grin, imagining tiny medieval nutritionists approving your diligence. Historians still debate whether these additions were believed to be functional or merely a cultural habit. But either way, your animals are well fed and content. You notice some animals are sick or limping. You separate them into a small pen, adjusting bedding and feed. Fringe practices encourage talking to the ailing creatures, promising wellness and protection. You murmur softly, inspecting hooves and coats, realizing that attentive care, regardless of superstition, is often the key to survival. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers had systematic approaches to animal care, or relied mostly on observation and instinct. And from your perspective, it seems a little of both. As the afternoon wanes, you begin cleaning the pens. Mucking out manure, replacing straw, and airing the barn fills your senses with earthy scents and subtle warmth. Fringe traditions sometimes involve tossing a pinch of herbs into the bedding for luck or pest deterrence. You do the same, enjoying the mingling of practicality and ritual. Historians still debate the efficacy of such measures, but the scent of fresh straw and herbs is undeniably pleasant. You pause and reflect on the animals' winter readiness. Pigs, cows, sheep, and chickens are warm, fed, and secure. Water is fresh, shelters are reinforced, and small rituals have added layers of psychological comfort. Fringe beliefs, charm placements, and whispered protections combine with hard labor, observation, and care to create an environment where survival is much more likely. But today, it seems obvious that both played crucial roles. As evening falls, you sit outside the barn, watching your animals settle into their cozy pens. The smell of hay, livestock, and winter air mingles with faint smoke from hearths in the village. Each task completed today represents foresight, skill, and a little eccentricity passed down through generations. The animals are prepared for cold nights, blustery winds, and deep snow. And you can't help but feel a profound connection to the countless villagers who did the same. Fringe rituals, attentive care, and simple human ingenuity have intertwined to create a system of resilience, ensuring that when winter arrives in earnest, both you and your animals will endure together. Finally, you step back, brushing straw from your sleeves, hands sore and back aching. The barn is secure, the animals are cozy, and the rituals, practical or symbolic, have provided reassurance. You inhale deeply, taking in the earthy aroma and crisp air, feeling a mixture of exhaustion, satisfaction, and quiet anticipation. You know the next steps will involve joining the village, pooling effort and continuing the layered preparation that medieval life demands. But for now, the barn, its inhabitants, and your diligence stand ready against winter's inevitable chill. The village awakens slowly beneath a pale morning sky, the smell of smoke, wood, and frost lingering in the air. Today, you're not working alone. It's time to join your neighbors for communal preparations. You probably won't survive, or, at least, the season won't be pleasant without collaboration, as winter is too harsh a master to face solo. You pull on your layered tunics, secure your patched boots, and trudge toward the open yard where the rest of the villagers are already gathering, each carrying tools, bundles of straw, or baskets of provisions. The first task is shared haymaking and ice cutting. You grab a pitchfork and begin moving hay with your neighbors, the stiff stalks brushing against your forearms. Some villagers work in pairs, tossing bales to each other with a practiced rhythm. Fringe tales suggest that humming while lifting hay ensures that the wind won't scatter it during winter storms, so you add a soft tune to your efforts. Historians still debate whether such musical rituals were widely observed or merely regional quirks. But it lightens the labor and keeps spirits buoyant. Ice cutting is next. You join a small group near the village pond, chiseling through frozen water to harvest blocks for refrigeration and storage. The wind bites at your cheeks as you chip, lift, and stack. Fringe traditions hold that tossing a sliver of ice into the river before working ensures safe passage for spirits and humans alike. You follow the practice with a smirk, imagining tiny water spirits nodding in approval. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers actually believed in such rituals or performed them habitually. But the communal activity is undeniably efficient. Weaving and repairing textiles are also shared tasks. You sit on a low stool alongside other villagers, mending blankets, stitching cloaks, and preparing wool for future garments. Fringe lore prescribes murmuring a short blessing over each item, promising warmth and protection for its wearer. You comply, appreciating the meditative rhythm of needle and thread. Historians still debate the prevalence and practical impact of these rituals, but the collective focus creates a sense of shared purpose, easing the mental load of long winter months. While working, you notice playful competitions arising naturally. Who can lift the heaviest hay bale? Who stacks ice most neatly? Or who stitches the fastest? These little contests, while lighthearted, have serious undertones. They encourage efficiency and innovation. Fringe accounts describe small wagers, like the winner keeping a lucky charm or first pick of preserves, which motivates the group further. Historians still argue whether these competitions were regular social fixtures or spontaneous occurrences. But they undeniably enhance morale and productivity. Lunch is a communal affair. You gather around a central fire, sharing bread, cheese, and ale with neighbors. The warmth, smells, and laughter provide a pause from labor and a moment of connection. Fringe practices suggest tossing crumbs onto the earth as an offering to local spirits, a gesture you indulge with a smile. Historians still debate the function of communal meals: sustenance alone, social bonding, or ritual reinforcement. You quietly appreciate that it serves all three purposes, sustaining both body and village cohesion. The afternoon brings shared tasks like reinforcing fences and checking communal granaries. You lift beams, hammer stakes, and patch holes, working in tandem with others. Fringe beliefs recommend speaking kindly to the tools while handling them, ensuring they perform without snapping or bending. You hum softly, testing the hammer and chisel as if they have personalities, finding that the small gesture makes the work oddly pleasant. Historians still argue whether such rituals influenced outcomes or were symbolic. But the rhythm of cooperation and effort is undeniably effective. Ice and snow become minor obstacles as the day progresses. Villagers form teams to clear paths, ensuring safe access to barns, homes, and shared storage. Fringe tales insist that stamping a pattern into fresh snow wards off mischievous spirits who might damage supplies. You participate enthusiastically, imprinting a crude but deliberate pattern along the walkway. Historians still debate whether these practices were widespread or localized quirks, but it gives you the satisfaction of exerting some control over the chaotic elements of nature. You notice that children are involved as well, performing small tasks like gathering firewood or feeding poultry. Their participation is a mix of learning, amusement, and practical necessity. Fringe advice encourages offering playful rewards or small charms to children to ensure they take the work seriously. You hand a young helper a tiny carved figure, noticing their pride in the task and the sense of continuity it represents. Historians still argue about the extent to which child labor was formalized versus informal. But here, guidance, learning, and ritual intermingle seamlessly. As afternoon wanes, you gather to divide labor for the coming days. Shared ice, hay, repaired textiles, and reinforced fences are inventoried, and villagers discuss rotations for ongoing maintenance. Fringe traditions suggest each group should name a winter sentinel responsible for monitoring supplies, a ceremonial gesture you join with a chuckle. Historians still debate whether this role was practical or symbolic, but having a designated person ensures accountability and a clear plan for continued readiness. By evening, you step back, surveying the result of communal effort. Hay is stacked, ice is stored, textiles are repaired, fences reinforced, and paths cleared. Fringe practices, minor rituals, and playful competitions have intertwined with practical labor, making the day both productive and socially reinforcing. Historians still argue about the necessity and prevalence of such community gatherings. But the tangible results, ready supplies, reinforced infrastructure, and boosted morale speak for themselves. Finally, you trudge home, sore but satisfied, the crisp winter air carrying scents of wood smoke and straw. Your muscles ache pleasantly, a reminder that survival is not passive. It is built on sweat, coordination, and centuries of knowledge passed down through generations. Fringe rituals, cooperative labor, and shared meals have strengthened not only the village's physical resources, but also its social bonds. You realize that winter, while daunting, is less threatening when approached collectively, a patchwork of effort, tradition, and occasional eccentricity creating a protective shield for the months ahead. As night falls, you sit near your hearth, warmed by firelight and the satisfaction of the day's achievements. The village is prepared, at least for now, and the rhythm of shared labor, small rituals, and community care will continue to echo through the season. You can almost hear the quiet hum of tradition and ingenuity vibrating through the walls, a reassurance that, together, humans can endure even the harshest winter. The morning greets you with a brittle chill, frost etching delicate patterns on window panes. Today, the focus shifts inward, winter cooking and meal planning. You probably won't survive the season, or at least won't thrive without knowing how to. Transform your stored provisions into meals that sustain both body and morale. You trudge into the kitchen, breath puffing in white clouds, and survey the rows of jars, barrels, and sacks that you and your neighbors meticulously arranged. The first task is soup and stew preparation. Root vegetables, salted meat, and dried legumes are brought to the hearth. You dice, chop, and stir, allowing the aromas of onion, carrot, and marrow to mingle with the lingering scent of wood smoke. Fringe lore suggests tossing a pinch of herbs over the fire as an offering for warmth and abundance, a practice you indulge in with a small smile, imagining miniature fire spirits nodding along. Historians still debate whether such rituals were widespread or localized traditions, but the sensory comfort alone is enough to justify the act. You turn to grains, boiling barley or oats for both immediate meals and storage-ready porridges. Fringe practices sometimes advise stirring the pot clockwise to encourage fullness and health. You comply with a grin, watching the steam curl upward. Historians still argue whether such superstitions were practical, symbolic, or both, but they add rhythm and amusement to a labor-intensive process. The act of cooking itself becomes almost meditative, each bubble and aroma a small reassurance that sustenance will last through the harsh months ahead. Preserving and cooking meat demands careful attention. You check salted pork and bacon, simmering small portions for immediate meals while ensuring the remainder remains securely stored. Fringe tales recommend whispering, encouraging words to the meat as it cooks, claiming this improves flavor or luck. You do so half jokingly, half sincerely, marveling at the interplay of ritual, attention, and patience. Historians still debate whether such practices were widespread or quirky regional traditions, but the effect on your mindset is tangibly feel invested and in control. Herbs and seasonings are next. Sage, rosemary, and thyme hang drying above the hearth, releasing fragrant clouds that mingle with the cooking aromas. You crush a few sprigs into a small mortar, imagining a dash into each pot of stew. Fringe accounts suggest tossing a pinch behind your shoulder to ward off illness or bad spirits. A ritual you follow with a chuckle. Historians still argue whether medieval cooks valued herbs for taste, medicinal purposes, or symbolic protection, and you begin to suspect it was a careful blend of all three. Baking bread is a critical task. You knead dough, feeling the sticky resistance beneath your fingers, shaping loaves for both immediate consumption and storage. Fringe traditions suggest whispering a blessing into each loaf for good fortune and longevity. You comply, smiling at the mixture of superstition and utility. Historians still debate whether bread-making rituals were symbolic or practical. But as the smell of baking fills the air, you notice the psychological comfort it provides. Midday is devoted to rationing. You portion food into daily servings, ensuring that stored items are used efficiently and that nothing is wasted. Fringe practices advise leaving a small portion of each meal untouched as an offering to spirits, a gesture you perform while noting the absurdity and charm of it. Historians still debate whether this was common practice or localized custom, but it instills a rhythm and mindfulness to food management that is undeniably practical. You then focus on preserving liquids. Ale, cider, and mead are transferred to sealed barrels, inspected for leaks, and occasionally stirred. Fringe lore sometimes prescribes a small blessing or tap on the barrel to ensure longevity and flavor. You indulge, marveling at the combination of human attention and superstition, maintaining both quality and morale. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers' beverage preservation techniques were universally effective or largely ritualized, but the results today feel robust. Mid-afternoon brings snacks and small treats. Dried fruits are mixed with nuts, honey is drizzled over bread, and small cakes are prepared from remaining flour. Fringe traditions suggest sharing a portion with children or neighbors as an offering to unseen spirits. You distribute a few pieces, feeling satisfaction in both the practicality of sharing and the symbolic act. Historians still debate whether these practices were widespread or rare, but they certainly fostered community bonds and ensured equitable distribution of provisions. While cooking, you also take inventory of herbs, spices, and seasonings. Dried leaves, seeds, and flowers are inspected, rebundled, or relabeled. Fringe practices occasionally recommend whispering the intended use of each herb into its bundle, a habit you replicate with a grin. Historians still argue whether these rituals influenced culinary outcomes. But the mindfulness keeps your kitchen organized and ready for winter demands. Finally, you plan weekly meals, considering both nutrition and monotony. You map out rotations of stews, porridges, breads, and preserved vegetables, balancing flavor, availability, and labor intensity. Fringe advice suggests placing a small token in the plan to ensure luck and abundance, which you do with a quiet smile. Historians still debate whether such planning was common or merely a careful improvisation, but from your perspective, it is an essential component of survival. As dusk falls, the kitchen smells rich with savory stews, sweet baked goods, and fragrant herbs. The rows of preserved food, carefully portioned grains, and sealed barrels create a sense of security. Fringe rituals, blessings, and symbolic gestures have intertwined with practical cooking to create meals that nourish both body and spirit. Historians still argue about the role of ritual in medieval culinary practice, but today the effects are palpable. Food is ready. Morale is high, and the household is prepared for long nights ahead. You sit by the hearth, exhausted but satisfied, tasting a small morsel of stew. The warmth spreads through you, a comforting reminder that preparation, though laborious, eccentric, and occasionally superstitious, is the key to enduring winter. You inhale the combined aromas of wood smoke, baking bread, simmering herbs, and roasted vegetables, letting the sensory tapestry remind you that survival is both art and ritual. Blending effort, ingenuity, and a pinch of whimsy. The morning breaks with a crisp clarity, frost sparkling on the thatched roofs, and a thin veil of smoke curling from chimneys. Today, you focus on heating and fuel management, critical elements for surviving the harsh winter nights. You probably won't last long without a carefully maintained supply of firewood and a reliable method for heating your home. You step outside, boots crunching over icy grass, ready to tackle a day of chopping, stacking, and strategizing warmth. Your first task is inspecting the woodpile. Logs from last autumn have been stacked, but moisture and rot are constant threats. You lift each piece, knocking lightly to test for hollow sound, discarding those that feel too damp or fragile. Fringe traditions suggest whispering a blessing over each log, wishing warmth and protection for the household. You hum a quiet tune as you work, feeling the ritual adds rhythm to the labor. Historians still debate whether these practices were genuinely believed or mainly habitual, but they help you stay focused and thorough. Chopping fresh wood is next. Axes swing rhythmically, splitting logs into manageable lengths. Fringe lore advises a small chant before each strike, claiming it encourages a clean split and prevents accidents. You comply with a half smile, amused but attentive. Historians still argue whether such rituals had practical effects or were mostly psychological. But the cadence keeps your energy steady as your arms ache from repeated blows. You sort the wood by type and size. Hardwoods like oak burn longer, ideal for overnight fires, while softwoods ignite quickly for cooking or brief warmth. Fringe wisdom occasionally prescribes stacking wood in alternating patterns to trap warmth or protect against winter spirits. You arrange the piles carefully, enjoying the blend of function and superstition. Historians still debate the prevalence and efficacy of such techniques, but your stack looks solid, organized, and aesthetically pleasing. Next, you inspect the hearth and fireplace. Soot and ash must be cleared to maintain efficient airflow and reduce fire hazards. You sweep carefully, checking for cracks in the masonry or loose stones. Fringe traditions sometimes suggest tossing a pinch of flour into the flames for good luck, a practice you replicate with a small chuckle. Historians still argue whether such gestures were widespread, but they add a playful layer to the otherwise laborious task. Mid-morning brings the task of rationing fuel. You estimate how much wood will be needed for cooking, warmth, and any social gatherings or communal events. Fringe practices suggest setting aside a small reserve pile for unexpected cold snaps or misfortune. You comply, arranging a neat corner with a few extra logs, appreciating the combination of foresight and superstition. Historians still debate whether fuel management was systematically practiced or left largely to habit and intuition. But your method feels efficient and reassuring. Outdoor preparation continues with clearing paths and reinforcing shelters for stored fuel. Snow, ice, and wind can bury or dislodge wood piles. You shovel and sweep, creating easy access and checking for hidden hazards. Fringe lore occasionally recommends sprinkling herbs or placing small charms along the paths to keep spirits content. You indulge, smiling at the whimsy while noting the practical benefit. Your pathways are now safe, visible, and accessible. Historians still argue about the prevalence of such rituals, but it seems irrelevant when the result is tangible. You turn to heating methods inside the house. Hearths are stacked with seasoned wood, bellows are checked for functionality, and iron tools for cooking are polished. Fringe traditions advise placing a small symbol near the hearth to invite warmth, a practice you replicate with a small carved figure. Historians still debate the symbolic versus practical purpose of these gestures, but the sense of order and reassurance is undeniable. Midday involves training younger family members in fire management. They learn how to arrange logs for optimal burn, how to safely ignite kindling, and how to tend the fire throughout the day. Fringe customs include reciting simple rhymes or counting sparks for good luck. You supervise, enjoying their laughter and curiosity, realizing that knowledge transfer is as crucial as the fuel itself. Historians still argue whether fire training was formalized or informal, but passing down skill ensures continuity and survival. Afternoon is devoted to stockpiling additional fuel. You chop branches left over from pruning, dry smaller twigs for kindling, and inspect communal fuel reserves. Fringe traditions sometimes involve small offerings, a pinch of grain or herbs tucked between logs as a gesture of gratitude to unseen forces. You comply, amused but thoughtful, realizing these actions add a sense of ceremony to repetitive labor. Historians still debate the efficacy and prevalence of these rituals, but they create a rhythm and mindfulness that transforms mundane work into a small meditation. As evening falls, you light the first fire of the night. The flames crackle, filling the room with warmth and a comforting glow. You watch the wood consume slowly, appreciating the careful layering of logs, the spacing, and the slow burn that will last through the early hours. Fringe rituals, blessing the logs and hearth, add an intangible layer of reassurance, weaving superstition seamlessly with practical labor. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers relied on ritual or observation. But today, it feels like both are essential. You sit back, hands warmed by the fire, surveying the stacked wood, the cleared paths, and the glowing hearth. The household is ready for long nights, cooked meals, and the occasional communal gathering around flames. Fringe practices, small charms, and whispered words have blended with meticulous work to create a sense of preparedness that is both practical and psychologically comforting. Historians still debate the necessity of ritual in medieval fuel management, but from your perspective, the warmth, light, and security it provides are undeniable. Finally, as night deepens, you feel the satisfaction of a day well spent. Firewood is chopped, stacked, and rationed. Hearths are clean, functional, and blessed. Paths are cleared. And knowledge has been passed on. The combination of physical labor, communal effort, superstition, and mindfulness ensures your household is ready to endure the harsh months ahead. You exhale, letting the glow of the fire, the scent of wood smoke, and the quiet reassurance of preparation settle over you. A gentle promise of comfort and resilience for the long nights to come. Dawn breaks with a soft silver glow, the frost sparkling across rooftops and frozen fields. Today, you turn your attention to health, hygiene, and small comforts, the final frontier in winter preparation. You probably won't survive without tending to the subtle but critical details that preserve both body and morale during months of cold, darkness, and confinement. You step into the small washroom space, the scent of herbs lingering, and take a deep breath, ready to address personal care and household cleanliness. First, you inspect water supplies. Wells and cisterns are checked for ice, contamination, or low levels. You carefully break ice, fetch water in buckets, and ensure a steady supply for cooking, cleaning, and drinking. Fringe traditions suggest dipping a pinch of salt into the water to ward off illness or malevolent spirits. And you follow along, half amused, half believing that any ritual fostering attentiveness is worth the effort. Historians still debate whether such practices were widespread or purely symbolic, but they offer reassurance and structure to your tasks. Next, you prepare hygiene tools. Cloths, brushes, and combs are cleaned and laid out neatly. You heat water gently over the hearth for washing, mindful that unheated water could be dangerous in frigid temperatures. Fringe lore sometimes prescribes dipping cloths in herb-infused water to cleanse both body and spirit. You hum softly while dipping a linen rag into rosemary-scented water, amused by the thought of invisible guardians of cleanliness. Historians still argue whether medieval hygiene practices were functional, ritualistic, or a mix of both. Laundry is next. You scrub garments and linens, wring them carefully, and hang them to dry in the warmest, least drafty corners. Fringe traditions suggest folding garments with a specific ritual gesture to ensure longevity and protection. You replicate this, smirking at the delicate folds of linen, appreciating how such gestures slow you down just enough to notice quality and wear. Historians still debate whether symbolic folding practices were common, but the deliberate care ensures that clothing lasts through the winter. You turn to personal grooming. Hair is brushed, fingernails trimmed, and small injuries attended to. Fringe advice sometimes includes anointing minor cuts with herbal salves while whispering protective words. You comply, observing how attention to small injuries prevents bigger problems, blending superstition with practical health. Historians still argue about the prevalence of these practices, but from your experience, they combine psychological comfort with tangible benefit. You inspect and maintain medical supplies. Poultices, dried herbs, and ointments are arranged and checked. Fringe traditions suggest sprinkling a small pinch of protective herbs on each jar, a gesture you mimic, appreciating both the aroma and the reassurance it provides. Historians still debate whether such practices were symbolic, functional, or both. But having the supplies organized and ready offers peace of mind, critical during long, harsh winters. Mid-morning involves tending to household cleanliness. Floors are swept, ashes cleared from hearths, and surfaces wiped down. Fringe customs sometimes recommend chanting softly while sweeping to ward off illness. You hum a simple tune, noticing that the rhythm of sweeping, combined with scent of straw and herbs, makes the work meditative. Historians still argue whether these practices were rooted in superstition or habit, but the effect on morale is unmistakable. You focus on small comforts next. Blankets are fluffed, cushions replaced, and furs rearranged for warmth. Fringe wisdom advises leaving small tokens, like a carved figure or a dried flower, in key locations to bring peace and good fortune. You comply, imagining the invisible guardians of comfort silently approving your efforts. Historians still debate whether such rituals were practical, symbolic, or a blend, but the psychological benefit is undeniable. Preparing the household for illness is essential. You arrange herbs, poultices, and warming compresses near the hearth. Fringe advice suggests placing a small charm next to each item to invite wellness, a practice you mimic while smiling at the combination of superstition and practicality. Historians still argue whether medieval households routinely integrated symbolic measures with medicine. But for now, your readiness feels comprehensive. As afternoon unfolds, you check on the emotional well-being of household members. Sharing warm food, engaging in quiet conversation, and performing small acts of comfort are as critical as tangible preparations. Fringe traditions suggest storytelling or gentle songs to ward off melancholy during long nights. You sit with family or neighbors, sharing tales and laughter, blending ritual, entertainment, and emotional care. Historians still debate the role of ritual in mental well-being. But the effect is clear. Morale is high and resilience strengthened. Finally, as evening descends, you review the cumulative preparation. Food is stored, clothing mended and layered, homes fortified, animals cared for, fuel stacked, and both hygiene and comfort attended to. Fringe rituals, charms, and symbolic gestures have threaded through each day, blending seamlessly with practical labor. Historians still argue about the prevalence and efficacy of these practices, but the combination of careful preparation, superstition, and human ingenuity creates a layered defense against winter's chill. You sit near the hearth, fire crackling, a warm blanket around your shoulders. The village is ready. You've performed a full cycle of preparation: physical, social, and psychological. Each action, from mending tunics to stacking logs, caring for animals to tending the hearth, contributes to a tapestry of resilience. Fringe practices add whimsy, ritual, and reassurance, while practical labor ensures survival. The final satisfaction is profound. The household and the community is ready. The final night falls gently, and you sit in quiet reflection, wrapped in the soft glow of the hearth and the faint crackle of burning wood. Outside, frost glimmers on rooftops, and a calm hush blankets the village. You can feel the cumulative work of weeks settling around you: the carefully stored food, the reinforced home, the tended animals, and the thoughtfully prepared comforts. Each task, each charm, Each whispered word has woven together to form a cocoon of safety, warmth, and reassurance. Your muscles ache pleasantly, a reminder of the labor that ensured your survival. Yet the ache is softened by the knowledge that every effort, practical or symbolic, has contributed to your resilience. You notice the scents of dried herbs, smoked meats, and wood smoke mingling in the air, and let them settle in your mind as a gentle meditation. The rituals, both fringe and familiar, blend seamlessly with hard work, offering comfort and a sense of agency in the face of the harsh winter ahead. You listen to the subtle sounds of the night, the soft groan of timber settling, the distant cluck of chickens in their coops, the occasional bark of a dog. Each sound is a reminder that life persists, even when the world outside is cold, dark, and unpredictable. You imagine tiny guardians watching over your home, the charms. The herbs, the carefully stacked provisions, auto-eyes a quiet smile to form. They need no real power. Their presence is enough to reassure you, to soothe the edges of anxiety, and to reinforce the sense that you are prepared. Your mind drifts to the coming days, knowing that winter will test patience, endurance, and creativity. Yet the careful layering of preparation, shared effort, and small acts of care has created a rhythm that makes the months ahead manageable. You feel the warm comfort of your hearth, the gentle weight of blankets, the secure walls around you, and the soft companionship of family or neighbors. Slowly, you exhale, letting each breath carry away tension, leaving only calm, warmth, and a deep sense of security. You close your eyes, letting the flickering firelight merge with the gentle hum of the night. The village, your household, your body, and your mind are ready. The cold cannot breach the defenses you have built, both tangible and intangible. Tonight, and through the months to come, you are safe. Now, you allow yourself to drift, feeling each moment stretch and soften, sinking into the gentle rhythm of survival, care, and tradition. Sleep arrives as naturally as the frost on the fields, bringing with it the quiet reassurance that effort, planning, and a little whimsical belief have carried you through.